Hello there, and welcome into the Hoosier Podcast presented by TheHoosier.com and powered by the Rivals Network. My name is Zach Browning, and we're back for another week of discussing Indiana football and basketball. Josh Pose and Colin McMahon are with me today. Gentlemen, how are we doing? Josh, we'll start with you.
In a word, cold. It's dark. It's 6 o'clock. Not enjoying this type of weather, but cold's a mindset, so we just got to keep pushing along. So I'm all right.
Colin?
Couldn't have said it better myself. It is cold. It is not fun, but basketball's indoors, which is nice. That's pretty much all I have to say.
The walk to basketball is not indoors, though. We've all endured that a little bit. Although, Colin, you're coming off of an 80-degree Thanksgiving, so I don't know if I want to hear it from you. All
True.
right. Are you ready, gentlemen? Let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with Indiana football this afternoon. I guess it's the evening now. We're recording this on the evening of Thursday. It's probably go up Friday morning. So let's get started. Without further ado, Indiana 11-1, closing the regular season with a win over Purdue. We're going to get to that in just a second, but we've got some housekeeping news to attend to. Obviously, we're recording this on Thursday evening. So just a few hours ago, earlier on Thursday, news broke that Tino Sinceri, Indiana's quarterbacks coach and co-offensive coordinator, he is leaving Indiana. He's heading out west, but he's staying in the Big Ten. He's going to be the new OC at UCLA after the Bruins fired Eric Bieniemy earlier today. So Tino Sinceri gone, although the other news that came along and coincided with that, gentleman, is that the rest of the assistants, the other 9 assistants, including Derek Owings, the strength and conditioning coordinator for Indiana, are staying. They all signed new multi-year deals and extensions to stay with the Hoosiers beyond just this upcoming year. So Sinceri's gone for Indiana, but that's really the only one leaving, at least from this assistant pool. Josh, I know we've talked, it's kind of been hinted at that Indiana is going to draw, the assistants are going to draw some attention from some of these programs. And I don't think it's surprising that Sinceri was the first to go and was poached quickly by another Big Ten and another big power conference school.
Yeah, I think today had its good and its bad news for Indiana. Tino Sinceri, obviously the quarterback guru, the whisperer, if you will, and just having him help Curtis Rourke move along a lot. But the best news of the day and of the year really is the other 9 assistants, including Derek Owens, staying for more than just next year. I think that what we know with Indiana football, they're kind of the stepping stone for a better job. And that's just what assistants are in college football. You tend to become an assistant, do really well at your job, and then get bumped up. You saw it with Kalen DeBoer. Went to Fresno State, then went to Washington, now Alabama. Guess where he started? Indiana. So I think it's really good to see that there's going to be some continuity, and they're I'm happy for Tino Sinceri because there's no one that really deserves it more than him. He's worked his tail off to get to this point, and now he has the opportunity to be an offensive coordinator, to take that next step and be at a great institution like UCLA in a great conference like the Big Ten.
I know IU's going to miss his swag down there on the field. There's not another assistant coach in Bloomington that is more well-dressed and more full of swag on the field than Tino Sinceri is. Colin, I'm coming to you this time. We talked about it, Josh hit on it a little bit, the importance of Indiana's other assistants staying. Bryant Haynes, who's on the short list for assistant coach of the year, the defense coordinator for Indiana, Mike Shanahan, who has orchestrated one of the top offenses in the country, calling plays for the Hoosiers this year. They're both staying. Those are really the 2 biggest pieces. And then obviously Derek Owings gets a lot of love from the Indiana players because of what the Hoosiers have all raved about his strength and conditioning program. So it's a good thing to see. Yes, Sinceri is gone. But the bright side of this, Colin, is that Indiana keeps the rest of its assistant coaches in Cignetti, and Josh mentioned it, the staff continuity. That's important not only for the staff and for the guys on the roster, but the recruits as well.
Yeah, exactly right. It was really good news to hear for this program because of just how successful the entire coaching staff is. I mean, many people focus solely on Kurt Cignetti, and while he has done an incredible job, it takes the team around him to kind of make the season. You know, from Bryant Haynes to Mike Shanahan to everybody else in the picture that is staying, it's gonna it's gonna prove to have more successful seasons for this Hoosier team versus if you saw 2 coordinators left or coordinators and other assistants leave and it was just kind of Signetti and a couple stragglers, you might not see the success seen this season in future seasons. So the news today that broke with Tino Sinceri, that's obviously not the greatest of news for Hoosier fans, but there definitely is a bright side, and there definitely is a bright future ahead for this IU football program.
And it's also important to note that since Indiana does not yet have a replacement, it's obviously rather early in the process, and Sirius is going to stay with Indiana through the Hoosiers postseason run, however long that is in the college football playoff. The Hoosiers will have their co-offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach for that run. We'll talk to Kurt Cinetti later this weekend and early next week as well. So we'll kind of see where his head's at. I doubt he's probably going to comment too much on it, but as the offseason wears on, that's something to keep an eye on where Indiana goes at that quarterback's coach position on the staff. Moving on, we're going to quickly highlight the early national signing period, early national signing day earlier this week. Indiana has a 21 member class for 2025. Signing day moved up earlier this year. It's earlier in the month of December than it has ever been with the transfer portal and college football playoff and stuff like that. It's a good change for college football, but 21 new signees for the Hoosiers, 14 of which Kurt Signetti confirmed earlier this week will enroll early for the spring semester here in Bloomington. So that's also a big thing for IU, just getting them around the team that much earlier. But it's a good, solid class, a strong class, including four-star Byron Baldwin, who was committed to Indiana, then not committed to Indiana, then recommitted to Indiana. So it's a talented class of players, 9 offensive players, 12 defensive players, a slew of guys in the trenches on both sides. It'll be interesting to see how those guys pan out over the next couple of years in Bloomington. I wouldn't expect any of them to really be too big of contributors, at least as true freshmen next year. But with all of that, the housekeeping stuff kind of out of the way, we're going to move on and talk about the 66-0 beatdown that Indiana handed Purdue last Saturday night in the snow, a night game for the Old Oaken Bucket, the 99th battle for the Old Oaken Bucket, and it was all IU all the time, Josh.
Yeah, that was one of those take out all your frustrations from last week's loss against Ohio State for Kurt Signetti. And not only that, it was the offense and defense for that matter getting back on track. Indiana had been off kilter since that halftime of that Michigan game. And little did we know Michigan would end up playing their best football from that point forward. So Indiana needed to get back on track. Obviously, things the chips didn't fall Indiana's way for Penn State to lose. Ohio State lost to Michigan. So this was the last game of the regular season before the college football playoff. It was one final tune-up. And my goodness, Indiana just dominated, getting right back on course. It was good to see Curtis Rourke and Elijah Surratt connect not once but twice, and one of them was for, I believe, 84 yards. I thought it was 86, but they're at the 16. So it is really good to see those guys connect. You get to see the run game produce a little bit more, the offensive line work and dominate, that get back to form ahead of what is going to be the toughest matchup of the season, which is next.
The largest margin of victory for IU in a bucket game ever, 66-0, and you bring up Rourke and Surratt. Rourke, 349 yards, 6 passing touchdowns. It tied a single game program record. Elijah Surratt, 8 receptions, 165 yards, and 2 receiving scores. It wasn't just the offense, though, Colin. It was the defense as well. The fewest total yards for Purdue in a game in program history. 67 total yards of offense allowed by the Indiana defense. Jalen Walker, a sack and a half, 4 tackles for loss, an interception, a forced fumble, 2 pass breakups, and 3 quarterback hurries. All in that game alone, Colin. He was dominant, and the defense as a whole for the Hoosiers was dominant all game long.
Yeah, and you kind of just took the stats right out of my mouth. I was about to rattle off all those numbers myself, but I'm glad you did it for me. But as you mentioned, the defense was really special. And when I was deciding what I was going to write about for that game, it was kind of no choice. Defense, defense, defense. It really was a sensational performance. And when you have the same amount of turnovers as you do first downs allowed, that is a recipe for success, to say the least. And you saw it, a shutout, and several players mentioned after the game, Jalen Walker, Mikhail Kamara, the shutout was important. Like they wanted to go out and they wanted to have Purdue score 0 points. Kamara even saying that if they were going to drive down the field, he was going to grab his helmet and run out on the field to prevent a Boilermaker score. But I think it was, a sign of what's to come. And although Purdue is not a great opponent, obviously, to do that to a Big Ten team is a recipe for success moving forward. And obviously, they're going to play a more skilled offense in a Georgia or in a Tennessee or in a Ohio State again, potentially. I think the defense is going to be dominant. And as good as the offense is, I think the defense is kind of going to lead the way in that playoff game.
It's really hard to kind of put into words the domination of a 66 to nothing scoreline. I mean, there are teams, SEC teams, Ohio State earlier this year against Akron and bye games that don't beat teams 66 to nothing, let alone a conference opponent, let alone a conference opponent in a rivalry game. So it was just crazy to see Indiana just nonstop for 60 minutes, just be unrelenting and destroy Purdue in that manner. Earlier this week, though, we did get some all Big Ten announcements. So we'll hop into those now. First off, Kurt Cignetti named Big Ten Coach of the Year. I'm not sure that's a surprise to anybody, and I wouldn't be a surprise if he is winning a handful of National Coach of the Year honors as well here in the coming weeks. Cignetti obviously turning this Indiana program around in year one, 11-1 during his first season as the Hoosiers frontman. Also, though, not just Cignetti, but the players got some recognition as well. Mikael Kamara, Aiden Fisher, and D'Angelo Pons on the defensive side of the ball were all named first team All Big Ten, as Colin spoke to the defensive prowess of this Indiana team. For the offense, it was Curtis Rourke on the second team, Elijah Surratt on the third team, and Mike Kadick on the third team as well. Honorable mentions were as follows: Justice Ellison, Miles Price, and Zach Horton, and Carter Smith. Offensively, CJ West, James Carpenter, Linnell Carr, Jalen Walker, and Sean Asbury. On the defensive side of things, for special teams, Miles Price again, Nicholas Radicic, and long snapper Mark Langston. Now, guys, as with anything, as with any all Big Ten teams, there's always some snubs, some guys that maybe should have been on that were left off. For me, I'm going to start here. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to start with Jalen Walker. There's 3 all Big Ten linebackers per team, and I'm not sure there are 9 linebackers in the conference better than Jalen Walker. Obviously, his teammate Aiden Fisher was an all-conference player, but Jalen Walker, and he showed it on Saturday against Purdue. Jalen Walker was phenomenal all season long, a really unsung and kind of unheralded player for this Indiana defense. He was fantastic. Josh, I'm going to come to you first. Any snubs offensively, defensively, anywhere on this Indiana team for all conference selections?
I think CJ West would be the snub for me just because he wreaked havoc in the interior defensive line spot all year long. But in the same breath, there's 18 teams, and there are some really talented defensive linemen in this league. So I don't have an issue with it, but at the same time, you can call it a snub. When you have 18 teams, it's really hard to fit into 3 separate teams the best players.
It's kind of the added caveat to this season is that there's 4 more teams to choose players from when you're selecting all Big Ten players. Colin, do you have anybody that was maybe snubbed or left off of an all Big Ten list this season?
I mean, you two mentioned the two biggest ones, but I'd like to shed some light on Nicholas Radicic. He missed one kick in the entire season. And so obviously he never made necessarily a game winner or a 50 plus yarder. But I feel like, the stats speak for themselves for him, and the rest of the special teams unit was really outstanding. And so, like you mentioned, the two defensive guys, plus some other defensive guys like Sean Asbury and others. I mean, there could have been a ton of more guys that made the all Big Ten teams, but it is what it is, I guess.
Guess the thing with Radicic is that he was just kicking too many extra points. Indiana never really stalled out in the red zone, so didn't have an opportunity for field goals. It was pretty much all extra points. The only other guy I would mention is Amari Farrell as just a sophomore, not even an all Big Ten honorable mention for Farrell. I think he'll still continue to have a great career in Bloomington. He was fantastic this season, creating a lot of turnovers at that kind of rover position in Bryant Haynes' defense. But Indiana still lots of guys on the all Big Ten list. The other thing that's got people talking is the fact that Indiana had one of the best offenses in the country this season and they had nobody on the first team all Big Ten. But it's kind of weird with the Hoosiers because the tandem of running backs, obviously Caleb Johnson was the best running back in the conference, but the running backs kind of took away each other's stats. Curtis Rourke probably wasn't better than Dylan Gabriel, no matter what the stats say. Elijah Surratt was good, maybe deserving of a second team selection, but probably not first team. So it's just hard, even though they had one of the best offenses of the country, to give Indiana a first team selection on the offensive side of things. Now, before we wrap up the football talk, though, gentlemen, let's head into the college football selection show, which is on Sunday. We'll hear that. It runs from like noon to 4, noon to 3. the selection show for the actual college football playoff and not the bowl games will be like the last hour of that show. And then Kurt Signetti will have a press conference around 4 o'clock. But a lot of talk. Indiana could go here. Indiana could go here. Colin, I'm going to come to you first because I know you have strong opinions, and I know you've been looking at this stuff for the last week. Where in your mind, if you had to predict today, of course, no conference championships have been played, where do you think Indiana would be playing as what seed and against whom?
You're right. I have been looking and I've really been trying to figure out what's going to happen because I'm sick of the waiting. You know, all of us are excited to go cover a college football playoff game wherever it may be. And it could go to a lot of places and it's going to be determined on two games, the Big Ten championship and then the SEC championship. And while the ACC, Big 12 and Mountain West championships are obviously important in their own right, they're not necessarily going to matter for IU because those champions are going to get auto bids and the losers are going to be surely behind IU. But for the Big Ten, it'll be determined on if Penn State wins and gets the bye, or if Oregon wins and gets the bye. And if Penn State does lose, how far will they fall? If they fall below Ohio State, that'll definitely be interesting, but I don't think they will. And then for the SEC championship, if Georgia loses, how far do they fall? Because that would be their third loss. Or if Texas loses, they would probably be the 5 seed. So I kind of decided to do a mock projection, and it looks to me like going back to Columbus is very much on the table. And if they do not take into account conferences, I think that's how it'll end up. If they do kind of try to make it so that teams and conferences don't play each other, I think that going to Georgia is very much on the table. But those two are kind of neck and neck. But I mean, Penn State is also another place where they could definitely play just depending on how the seeding works out.
Josh, what are your thoughts on where you think, what's your prediction, I guess, on where you think IU might go?
I haven't looked too far into it because it's kind of like one of those things, whatever happens, happens. I can't control it no matter how many times I Google projections and scenarios and this and that. I did see something that there's like a 30% chance that they go to Notre Dame based on the ESPN All-State predictor. Yes, please, and thank you. I don't think that'll happen. I like Colin said, if they take into account the conference opponents, yes, Georgia. I think Georgia moves up. Obviously, they move up if they win. If they lose, they'll move down. I don't think Indiana will end up playing them. I'm gonna go with either Notre Dame or Penn State right now.
I'm in agreement with both of you a little bit. I think Ohio State might be
Well,
the
no, duh. There's 4 teams that they could play right now.
well, yes, but I think Ohio State's probably the most likely outcome at this point, just with the fact that IU and Ohio State don't play this week. And I would see it'll just be interesting. Obviously, Georgia and Texas, I think, will be the biggest ones because if Georgia wins, Texas will probably be the 5 and push everybody back one, which would obviously put IU against Ohio State. But then if Texas wins, does Georgia drop below Tennessee? And then maybe Neyland is a trip for IU? But who knows? There's so much that can change, and the committee will do what the committee does, as is always the case. But that'll wrap up our basketball discussion, though, for today. We're going to move on to football discussion. We're going to move on to basketball now, talking about the 6-2 Indiana Hoosiers on the hardwood. The Hoosiers 6-2 after beating Sam Houston State 97-91 or 97-71 earlier this week. And in that game, Luke Goody had 18 points, a career high 5 3-pointers. He was fantastic. Started off the bench for Indiana, but maybe one of the bigger stories, Colin, was that Indiana looked marketably better than they did in the Bahamas. Obviously, going 1-2 in the battle for Atlantis wasn't a great showing for Indiana, losing to Louisville and Gonzaga in the fashion that they did. And the Hoosiers overall looked much better than they did in the Bahamas.
They really did. I mean, although it was against Sam Houston of all teams, I think they really improved, top to bottom, from the offense to the defense. And I know we're gonna talk about the one big versus two big lineups. That's a big, topic of discussion right now. But that aside, I think they really played well. And, you think of Sam Houston as not a great opponent. They were top 150, I believe, in the NET. So obviously a mid-major from Conference USA, but not necessarily the worst mid-major you could have possibly played, and they looked dominant. Besides the first 5 minutes of the game and then the first five-ish minutes of the second half, it was complete and utter domination. You mentioned Luke Goody, Miles Rice had 19, Malik Renew had 18 and 10 for a double-double. It was really a great performance. And after the game, Luke Goody gave us probably the best press conference in a long, long time. And he said that, the team is much improved, how talented they are, et cetera, et cetera. So, there is reasons for hope if you're an IU basketball fan, despite what we saw last week in the Bahamas.
Still early in the season. Big Ten play hasn't yet started. That will start on Monday when the Golden Gophers come to town, and then Indiana travels out west to not the West Coast, but to the Plains area in Nebraska to take on the Cornhuskers. Now, Josh, I'm going to come to you on the next one, talking about the two big lineups versus the one bigs lineup. The numbers are all out there. It's pretty obvious that the two big lineup is not as good as the one big lineup. The one big lineup with just Malik Renew is a little bit better offensively, a little bit worse defensively, and vice versa. Josh, you have the floor to speak about the two bigs versus the one big lineup for Indiana.
Yeah, I spent like the entire game on Tuesday just going through the plus minuses, and raw plus minus does not show anything. Obviously, they're just specifically with one player. So but I do think that with a group of guys, the plus minus works more. And if it's over a collective amount of time, yes, that works more. So plus 34 with one big, -8 with two bigs. And Zach, I went back and watched the game and I screenshot and sent you some screenshots. I have never seen worse floor spacing than what I saw when Renew and Ballo were on the floor together. There were either five guys above the top of the key, or there were five guys below the free throw line, and they were all just clumped up together. When there was one big on the floor, you could just see more spread out. And Luke Goody had a fantastic game. Why? Because when there was one big on the floor, he made all five of his threes. There was more spread offense. There was more dribble drive. Miles Rice with 19 points was allowed to go on the pick and roll. And with that spread offense, he was allowed to go downhill, get to the cup, and score. I want to see that more often. I don't know if it'll work as much with booty ball and Big Ten play. You might have to go two bigs, but Michigan has figured it out with two bigs. Indiana should, but as long as it works with just one, you got to continue with what works if you're Indiana.
I will say Michigan a little fortunate that they have a 7-footer in Danny Wolf that can handle the ball like he can. Indiana doesn't really have that in Malik Renew or Umar Bala, but Bala only played 19 minutes against Sam Houston State. It was Malik Renew that got a lot of the run as the single big. And it's one of those things where if Indiana is going to be a threat to take on these top teams in the country, like a Gonzaga or like a Louisville, even though Louisville's probably not one of the top teams in the country, especially with the injury issues they've had, they're going to have to be able to compete. They're going to have to be able to go up and down the floor. That's the biggest thing to me, though, is the ability to run the floor. Indiana and Mike Woodson has talked all offseason long about their desire to push the tempo and play at a faster pace. With two bigs, that's and directly contradicting what you're saying and what you've said all offseason. Playing with one big allows four guys that are theoretically better ball handlers on the floor than having two bigs. So we'll see what Mike Woodson decides to do on Friday against Miami of Ohio. If we go back to seeing a predominantly two big lineup, or if it's going to be a lot of staggering the minutes for Anu and Ballo, he's got a decision. And I think if I had to guess, the decision would probably be sticking with the one bigs and kind of staggering each other. The numbers just don't lie. And as you mentioned, Josh, the plus minus can be what it is in basketball, especially, but the numbers, the advanced metrics, the net rating with one on the floor versus the other versus two, it doesn't match. And the eye test is all there for everybody. You can see it with two bigs versus one big, but we're going to stop that discussion now. We're going to stop discussing Sam Houston State, move on to Indiana's Friday night matchup with Miami of Ohio. Miami of Ohio coming into this game with a record of 5-2. They beat Air Force earlier this week on Monday. And in that game, Miami of Ohio had a guard go for 42 points. Indiana is going to see some scoring. They're going to see it from a Carmel graduate himself. Yes, I'm going to shout out Pete Suter. Pete Suter, 42 points on Monday against Air Force for Miami of Ohio. He's averaging a team best 17.4 points per game. He's not a lights out shooter from 3-point range, around 34.5%, but he's going to do things that necessarily don't show up in the stat sheet. Is a guy that's going to get you 5-6 rebounds from the guard spot. He's going to turn it over less than he gets assists. And if he can score 42 points a night, obviously, if he can get close to that, he's a big time player for Miami of Ohio, and one, Colin, that Indiana is going to have to look out for on Friday.
Yeah, when I saw a guy from Carmel going for that many points and he's playing IU on Friday, I'm sure I, like everybody else, was thinking the same thing. Oh wow, he's gonna score 40 against the Hoosiers. That's it's kind of what the consensus was on Twitter. We'll see what happens. Obviously, the defense on Friday is gonna be better than he's faced all season. But for a former Carmel Greyhound to come back in state, it'll definitely be interesting. And Miami has been an all right team to start out the season, but like Sam Houston, I expect IU to kind of dominate that game with the one big lineup to really see if it sticks. We'll see if Luke Goody is the first off the bench. It's kind of been a rotation of who's been first off the bench. Bryson Tucker has been first a couple of times. But I think Luke Goody is going to go off again with this one big lineup. Like Josh mentioned, the floor spacing is just so much different with one big versus two. I think that'll be a big key on Friday as well.
Right now, as of Thursday evening, Miami of Ohio is 166th in Kim Palm. So to put into perspective, that's around 30, 40 spots lower than Sam Houston State before they took on Indiana. Josh, any thoughts on Miami of Ohio coming into Bloomington on a Friday night that's expected to be rather cold in Bloomington?
I mean, Colin hit it on the nail. I think watching Indiana basketball for the past 20, 21 years now, um, I feel like every single Indiana kid that's come into Assembly Hall has dropped at least 25 points and hit like 85% of their threes. So this time, you're not going to fool me. He's going to make the threes, and I'm not going to be surprised. And I think that Indiana still does win, but it is going to be a frustrating 10 minutes of watching Suter just shoot lights out at Assembly Hall.
We'll see what happens on Friday. And then, of course, Big Ten play opens up on Monday against Minnesota, as I mentioned. Real quickly, before we close things out today, Josh, I'm going to come back to you quickly. It's definitely too early to say any game, especially in the Big Ten, is a must-win game. But you look at the schedule for Indiana. They start with Minnesota in the Big Ten. Then they go at Nebraska. Nebraska, a really good start to the season. Obviously, a win over Creighton for the Cornhuskers. Indiana desperately wants to avoid an 0-2 start in the Big Ten in conference play, especially after what happened in the Bahamas. So how important is it, I guess, for Indiana to beat Minnesota on Friday and start 1-0 in conference play this season?
It's vital at this point. It's not if they lose, hit the panic button, but for confidence purposes. You get two Big Ten games before you go back to some bye games, and then you go into the meat and potatoes of the season. So you got to start off strong. You got to go 1-0. Be at the top of the conference. Look good. Do it in style. Get some style points. Minnesota is not a very good program. Ben Johnson really struggling there. So I got to think that that's a must win. But at the same time, I think Indiana's. I'm not going to go to I'm going to go to Ken Palm. Indiana's current Ken Palm rating is just 5 spots lower than what they went to the Bahamas with. It's time to chill off a little bit, cool off. Panic button can stay away, can even skirt off the table a little bit, and you can play your brand of basketball. If you can play the Sam Houston State game over and over again, you'll win 10, 11, 12, 13, even 14 Big Ten games. So got to get off to a strong start, but you can't panic at this point.
Exactly right. A lot of the panic stemming, obviously, from what Indiana did or didn't do, I guess, in the Bahamas. But you got to think about the competition. Obviously, beating Providence, that's a good win. A Big East school. Big East not doing the best so far to start the year, but we'll see how Providence ends up. That'll likely be a decent win for Indiana come the end of the season. Gonzaga is obviously one of the top teams in the entire country. They dismantled Baylor to begin the year by 20 plus, and Louisville's probably a little bit better in the first year of Pat Kelsey than people might have anticipated, although Indiana might get hurt by the fact that Louisville's probably going to have a rougher end of the season without two of their top 3 or 4 best players. for the rest of the season due to injury. So we'll see how that loss shapes up come the end of the season. Colin, do you have any final thoughts on Indiana's Big Ten opener? Because we won't have another podcast out before then against Minnesota.
Yeah, and these two games are, I guess, still relatively new, but they've been around for a little while. The two Big Ten openers in early December, and they're a lot more important than you'd think because last year Indiana was struggling in February, and people, were calling for Woodson's job, etc. And they ended up finishing 10-10, and a lot of people might have thought, wait, they seem a lot worse than 10-10. They seem a lot worse than sixth in the Big Ten tournament. And the reason why is because they were playing a lot worse than that at the end of the season because they got two wins in December, Maryland and Michigan. They went 2-0 to start out Big Ten play. And then the year before that, the year where they were a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, they were, tied for second place in the Big Ten at the end of the season, and people might have said, "Oh, they're probably a little better than that. They're clearly the second best team after Purdue." But they took an early loss to Rutgers in December that a lot of people may have forgotten about. So these games, well, they're just a couple games in December, are really going to be the difference when, tiebreakers are going to matter, where one game is going to determine whether you're fifth versus 12th in the Big Ten tournament. And, they're going to be games that people may forget about, but they count all the same in the Big Ten standings at the end of the year.
You're exactly right, Colin. And as we conclude today's episode of the Hoosier Podcast, again, Indiana football off this week, we'll see and await their fate on Sunday afternoon, where Indiana will be playing in the college football playoff. Obviously, Indiana basketball Friday night against Miami of Ohio, Monday night against Minnesota, and then next Friday in Lincoln against Nebraska as well to start the Big Ten slate for Indiana. Well, that will conclude this week's episode of the Hoosier Podcast presented by TheHoosier.com. As always, to stay up to date on all of the latest news surrounding Indiana athletics, head over to TheHoosier.com. And of course, you can follow us on all of our social medias, which can be found by going over to @IndianaRivals on X/Twitter. Once again, for Josh Pose and for Colin McMahon, I've been Zach Browning saying thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.